Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for Salt Lake City's Facebook Ask Me Anything AMA on fair housing. My name is Tony Milner. I'm the Policy and Program Manager in the Housing and Neighborhood Development Division of Salt Lake City, and I'll be helping moderate today's AMA. We have an excellent group of panelists joining us today to help inform this conversation about Fair Housing Act and federal and local protections afforded to renters and homeowners, not just in Salt Lake City, but statewide. So joining us today, you'll get to meet them in just a little bit. We have four panelists. First, we have Ethan Sellers, Community Development Grant Administrator with Salt Lake City in the Housing and Neighborhood Development Division. We also have Nick Jackson, Staff Attorney with the Disability Law Center. Monique Scott, Community Resource Center Director from the South Valley Services. And Liz Watson, Vice President of Residential and Domestic Violence Services at the YWCA. We'll hear from the panelists in just a moment, but again, I just want to make sure, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today here on Facebook. We're scheduled for an hour. We'll go until 11 o'clock. Please know that we definitely want to hear from you during this conversation, so please feel free to add any of your questions to the chat, and we'll try to get to those as much as possible. So our intentions for this AMA is to provide information about fair housing protections and what to do if you or someone you know have experienced discrimination in housing. Also, we want to make sure that you're aware of local resources that can help with these issues. So during the AMA, we're going to be adding links to the chat for the city's website on fair housing, as well as other local resources, including some of the agencies that will be helping us out as panelists today. So last week, Salt Lake City Mayor Erin Mendenhall held a press conference to announce her proclamation recognizing April as Fair Housing Month. The mayor supports the renewed federal energy to uphold and strengthen the Fair Housing Act. Recently, the Secretary of Department of Housing and Urban Development, Marcia Fudge, said, quote, "I am prioritizing equity in housing. We are focusing on putting fair housing and civil rights back at the forefront of HUD's mission," end quote. April is also Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and Mayor Mendenhall also recognized Congress's recent renewal of the Violence Against Women's Act. This lapsed in 2019. It's a great bill. Mayor also highlighted the protections in housing afforded to victims of domestic violence, which is covered under this federal act. Two of our panelists represent agencies that specialize in domestic violence issues, and you'll definitely want to stay tuned to hear them out about what they do, the amazing work they do, and the services that they offer. So before I turn things over to the panelists, again, we just want to make sure that this AMA is informative as much as possible, and remind everyone to please add your questions into the chat, and we will try to get to those questions. All right, with that, let me turn things over to our first panelist, Ethan Sellers. Ethan, you want to take a moment and just reintroduce yourself to everyone?
Hi, my name is Ethan Sellers. I work in Salt Lake City Housing and Neighborhood Development. Or HAND. Salt Lake City HAND's mission is to develop and enhance livable, healthy, and sustainable neighborhoods. And then we also receive federal HUD grants and try to carry out the missions of HUD like fair housing.
Excellent. So Ethan, first question, what is fair housing?
Yeah, so Title 8 of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, commonly known as the Fair Housing Act, prohibits discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And then in 1988, Congress updated that to expand coverage to discrimination based on familial status. So that could be the presence of a child under the age of 18 or a pregnant woman, and established new enforcement mechanisms for HUD in the Department of Justice. And then one of the important things to remember about the Act for Fair Housing is what spurred it was the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. So this was in response to his tireless work for equal housing rights for every American. So 3 days after his assassination is when Congress passed it. So there's a direct correlation there to his work.
Wow. Who's protected under fair housing?
Yeah, so some of the groups I just mentioned, again, like race, color, religion, sex, national origin, familial status, or disability. And then also one thing that's important is there are local protections, because states or local governments can add additional protections to go further than the federal enforcement. So in Utah, we do have protections for source of income. So that could be like Social Security or veterans benefits, survivors benefits. So a landlord can't discriminate based on how you're paying for your housing, sexual orientation, and gender identity.
So in that case, can someone who isn't a member of a protected class file a fair housing complaint?
Yeah, so anyone injured or affected by a violation of fair housing may file a claim. So the law recognizes prospects, applicants, or residents who've suffered discrimination because they are members of a protected class, or because their household members, relatives, friends, or guests are members of a protected class. So again, that is a yes, anyone can report.
So what conduct is banned under Fair Housing Act?
Yeah, so any of those protected groups that I mentioned earlier, how this plays out is usually refusing to rent or negotiate with a tenant or potential tenant on housing. So how this plays out is this could be setting different terms, conditions, privileges of rental housing, such as lease, rental charges, security deposits. So again, telling one person or group that the deposit would be X amount, and then telling a protected class group that it would be double that amount. Or threatening, coercing, or intimidating with anyone exercising their right to fair housing. So a landlord can't come after you for seeking out protections for your fair housing rights.
What are some of those common acts of discrimination here in Salt Lake City?
Yeah, some of the unfortunate news is the Disability Law Center, who we also have on this call. Over 300 calls from Salt Lake City residents happen on year on average. And so the most kind of common housing discrimination that we see are based on disability, national origin, and race. And so there was over 97 cases of disparate treatment regarding housing discrimination in Salt Lake City. And then over this time period of the past couple of years, there was over 1,000 reports of people who felt that they had been discriminated against, and 456 of those required short-term assistance. And then some additional things to keep in mind is if a landlord refuses to engage with you in a real estate transaction, refuse to rent or sell housing to you, and then some of the things like discriminate against you on the terms or conditions on the sale of an apartment or home, and refusal to receive an offer to engage, like if they just stop communicating with you altogether, indicate that housing is not available when it actually is available. So that could be something where something's online and you contact the landlord, speak to them in person, and they're like, oh, sorry, it's no longer available. And then the next week you see that it still is available. And then discriminate by providing different facilities or services. So this could be redirecting you to a different neighborhood, anything like that. And so the most important thing to keep in mind is that discrimination is rarely blatant. It's evolved and it's more often disguised than covert.
Excellent. I think this is actually a great time to kind of bring in and transition Nick Jackson, staff attorney with the Disability Law Center. Nick, can you tell us again, kind of just give another introduction to yourself, who you are, who is the DLC? Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. So my name is Nick Jackson. I'm a staff attorney at the Disability Law Center in Salt Lake. We are a nonprofit law firm. We do a lot of things. Our mission is to protect and enforce the civil rights of people with disabilities in Utah. We also do fair housing work on behalf of anybody that feels like they've been a victim of discrimination. Good.
So my first question to you, and I'm going to ask this of Monique and Liz as well. So just kind of what is, when the public is reaching out to the Disability Law Center, what are like the main frequently asked questions that you guys are seeing?
One common question we get, especially when it comes to fair housing, is, are you sure I don't have to have a disability to call you guys? And the answer is yes. Our fair housing work, we represent people, on the basis of race discrimination, gender, source of income, all of those protected classes that Ethan mentioned. There are a couple other areas where we get a lot of questions. Probably the biggest area of questions are surrounding assistance animals, which I know a lot of people are familiar with. Assistance animals is an umbrella term that we use, and that includes service animals, emotional support animals, and therapy animals, all of which are a little bit different legally. And so we use that term assistance animals. And then we also get a lot of questions about familial status discrimination, which means you have a kid in the household and you're being treated differently by a landlord because of that. And then race and national origin discrimination as well.
Wow. Who may be held liable for fair housing violations?
So the short answer is that most landlords are covered by the Fair Housing Act, and so could be held liable for discrimination. The actual section of the law that lays that out is not written very well, and it's the source of a lot of confusion. It really boils down to really small landlords with no reason to know better are exempt. It's called the Mrs. Murphy Exemption. Mrs. Murphy is a fictional widow who is renting out her basement to some tenants after her husband has died, to make ends meet. And she's not a professional. She doesn't have any, legal training or real estate training or anything like that. And so Congress decided to leave people like her off of the hook. But anybody with a reason to know better tends to be covered. So anybody using a property manager, anybody with using an LLC or something like that, anybody that owns more than a handful of properties. So all that being said, the short answer is that most any landlord can be held liable for Fair Housing Act violations.
So you kind of mentioned some of the frequently asked questions. Can you actually give an example of a fair housing situation? Like, what are some of the ways that people may be discriminated against from some of the protected classes that you were talking about?
Sure, I could give some obvious examples we hear, and then some situations that are maybe less obvious.
Yes, please.
Sometimes, maybe not most of the time, but sometimes it is blatant. For instance, a woman with a 3-year-old son is applying for an apartment and might just be told, "No, you've got a kid. We're not going to let you rent here." Other times, it's more subtle. Ethan mentioned this. We call it sometimes smile and a nod discrimination, and it's those situations that are maybe less obvious to the person that's being discriminated against. So one example might be, say somebody is of Mexican descent, they're Hispanic, they call for to look, see if an apartment's available, and they're told, "Oh, thanks for calling. It's really too bad. I'm sorry to tell you, but we've already rented out that unit. So good luck on your search, have a good day." As far as that person knows, the unit's been rented out. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. And we actually run what we call a fair housing testing program to try to figure out when this less obvious discrimination is happening. And what we do, for instance, we might have an applicant, an Hispanic applicant that was born in Mexico and has a noticeable accent. And they will call, check up on an apartment. "Hey, I saw this unit, is it available?" And they'll record their interaction with the landlord. And shortly after that person calls, we might have a white tester call or somebody with no noticeable accent. And we can compare what happens to those two people, both qualified to rent the unit. One is obviously Hispanic and one is not. And more often than we would like to see, the Hispanic applicant is told that the unit has already been rented, again, with a smile and a handshake. But then a white applicant might call 10 minutes later, and they're invited to come down and take a look and fill out an application. So that would be an example of less obvious discrimination that's sometimes hard to find if you're just, the person looking for an apartment.
Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned how number of calls you're getting for animals, pets, especially service animals, therapy animals. Can you kind of tell us a little bit of the difference between service and therapy animals, and then kind of like a case example of, or kind of like a typical case that you guys see over at the Disability Law Center?
Sure. And this, just like coverage of the Fair Housing Act, this is also an oft misunderstood area of the law. We get a lot of questions about it. Again, trying to make a very complicated area, give some basic rules that can be applied. Under the Fair Housing Act, whether you have a service animal or an ESA is not as important as it is in places like restaurants or grocery stores, where service animals are allowed and that's it. Under the Fair Housing Act, the rules are a little bit different. So a service animal, those are the ones that you would see in places like grocery stores or restaurants. Service animals are specifically trained to do a task for a person with a disability. So a seeing eye dog is an example. They're dogs that are trained to pick up dropped items, open doors, turn off lights. They're, seizure dogs, also support dogs, all sorts of things like that. Emotional support animals are also animals that are necessary for somebody's disability. But the only difference is that they're not specifically trained to do a task. These kind of animals are used for disabilities like post-traumatic stress disorder, extreme anxiety disorder, other disabilities where the animal's presence can actually serve to help support the person with a disability. So under the Fair Housing Act, the thing to remember that's important is if you have a disability and you need to live with an animal of some kind because of your disability, that's what matters under the Fair Housing Act. The task aspect doesn't matter, just matters that you have a disability and need the animal because of that disability. And then a typical question that we might get concerns kind of the ins and outs and the details of making that happen with a landlord, particularly with ESAs, emotional support animals, because the use is a little bit less obvious. Seeing eye dog is easy to see and kind of easy for anybody to grasp what they're doing. Emotional support animals, psychiatric service animals, those kind of things are harder to, they're a little bit less obvious. And so we get a lot of questions about, my landlord says that my doctor needs to sign a sworn affidavit. Is that true? My landlord asked me what my disability is and how I got it. Do I have to disclose that? My landlord says that there's a pet fee, but I have a service dog. Is that okay? So there's a lot of negotiation to be done and a lot of, kind of just day-to-day practical issues that people run into with their assistance animals and their housing providers.
One last thing that I kind of want to ask you before we kind of move on to some of our other panelists, just what are you guys seeing? What are the most common acts of discrimination that's done by landlords or people selling their home? Can you kind of go through some of the most kind of common things that they're trying to do to kind of maybe push people away?
Yeah. In addition to some of the things I mentioned earlier, some of the really common issues that we see involve housing vouchers. Those are covered under the Utah's source of income protection. And there are a lot of cases where a housing provider just says, we're not going to take your voucher. And if people are unfamiliar with vouchers, the most common one is called a Section 8 voucher. It used to be called that. It's now called a housing choice voucher. And that's the point, is to help people live in neighborhoods that they choose to live in. And what it is the federal government pays for part of people's rent. Essentially, you qualify based on your income, and the purpose of the voucher is to allow you to have more opportunity for you and your family than you would have in a neighborhood that you can afford with your very, very low income. And there are a lot of housing providers that unfortunately just say, we don't want to participate in this program, which defeats the whole purpose. You know, if every housing provider on the east side of Salt Lake doesn't want to take a housing voucher, then the east side of Salt Lake, you know, remains upper income, and it remains, you know, the benefits and opportunities of living there remain unavailable to part of our population. So that's one thing that we see a lot, and we're really working with landlords to try to figure out, you know, how can we facilitate people using these vouchers, you know, to allow them to kind of seek out, you know, the opportunity that we think of as the American way.
Excellent. One last question for you while I got you right now is just that what is your recommendation? What's your advice if anyone in the community feels that they've been discriminated against, or someone that they know has maybe been discriminated against in housing? What steps would you encourage them to do?
Yeah, so there are some remedies available that are cheaper and easier than court, and that people can do on their own or with an attorney, to kind of prepare for those things. You know, documenting a situation that you're having with your landlord is really important. Getting stuff in writing. If you have a request that's denied, if you're told that you have to move out, whatever it is, start getting those communications with your landlord in writing, or otherwise documenting those, because that's going to be important whether you're working to, you know, resolve things informally with your landlord, or you're talking to a lawyer or something like that. And then another thing people can do is they can contact us. So we're a little bit like a legal aid organization, in that we provide free representation and information to people, regardless of their income level or anything like that. So if you're having a fair housing issue, at the very least, we can give you some kind of pointers on things that you can do to help advocate for yourself in that situation. And then in some cases, when it's unfortunately necessary, we also provide legal representation.
Excellent. Thank you, Nick. Again, those listening, if you have any specific questions for Nick or about the Disability Law Center and their services, please feel free to put those into the chat, and Nick will stick around to answer all questions that we get. Okay, with that, I want to switch over to Monique Scott. Monique, will you do a little introduction about yourself and about South Valley Services?
Yes. Hi, everyone. So my name is Monique Scott. I'm the Community Resource Center Director for South Valley Services. And for those who haven't heard about South Valley Services before, we are a nonprofit agency that assists victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. So we've been serving the community since 1998, and our mission is really to provide safe shelter, advocacy, case management, and prevention services to men, women, and children who are experiencing any type of psychological, physical, emotional, financial, or sexual abuse at home. We really aim to empower individuals and communities through education and help them recognize their self-worth and develop the skills needed to reach their greatest potential and become self-sufficient in the community.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Monique. So same question that I asked Nick. So what are like the top frequently asked questions that people call up or reach out to South Valley Services for?
So I would definitely say our top needs are shelter. For those experiencing domestic violence, sometimes they are in really high danger. and at risk for homicide or at risk of their children being hurt. So sometimes if they don't have that social support, they need a place to go away from the perpetrator. So we offer emergency shelter, and our shelter is located in Salt Lake County. And at our shelter, we can house men, women, and children. So it's completely free of cost. And for singles who are looking for shelter, we do have them, they are able to get their own room, but they have maybe 1 or 2 roommates. And for families seeking shelter, they have their own private room, which I'm really grateful that our shelter is able to accommodate that, especially coming from some of the trauma they might have experienced. Having that private area and room when you first come in to kind of just reanalyze everything, get your plan set is really helpful. And also at our shelter, we offer free childcare. So if we do have some parents who are coming in that are working, and they can't afford childcare at that time, we can offer that to them so they can keep their job while we work with them to gain housing again. And we also get many calls for help with case management. So that's available to both our shelter residents and community members. And for case management, we offer a wide range of services. So we can assist with housing, mental health referrals, legal assistance, food and clothing, employment and childcare resources. And then 2 other great resources available at South Valley include, we have a mental health clinical team that can provide free therapy to both adults and children. We offer individual sessions, group sessions if you'd like to take it with your family. And we have both children and adult therapists. And right now we serve those who are English speaking, and we also have a bilingual therapist as well for those who speak Spanish.
So recently there's been a couple of studies that have kind of come out or basically showing that unfortunately over the past year, there have been increases in issues of domestic violence. Have you guys seen that yourself over at South Valley Services?
Yes, I definitely think in this past year too, especially with the pandemic and COVID-19, when those stay-at-home orders came out, we've seen a really high increase in the number of people experiencing domestic violence. If they're not able to go to work, maybe their childcare is closed down, they don't have as many outlets to leave their home, and they don't have as many people watching out to identify that child abuse. Especially with those who have children, if they're doing a lot of online learning, I feel like our teachers are really at the forefront for seeing signs of abuse for those children. But of course, with these stay-at-home orders, we've kind of seen a decrease in the number of services reported. So we're really just trying to get back out into the community, make it a little bit more accessible by offering phone appointments, hotline calls. We have that available 24/7 to let people know that they do have these options and they can reach out to us regardless of their situation or if they have to stay at home.
What are some of the main issues that you guys are seeing with the clients that you're serving for related to their housing situation? Whether or not they're temporarily leaving their housing or they're permanently leaving their housing, how they're able to be in housing in between or then rehoused once they try to either go back or go someplace else for transitional or permanent housing. What are some of the trends that you're seeing for the housing needs and barriers towards housing with the clients that you serve?
I would say some of the biggest housing needs and concerns we see are landlords who are threatening clients with evictions that are related to the domestic violence issues that are going on into the household. And I think with this, it's just because a lot of our clients and landlords are not fully aware of some of the state protections that are put in place for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. One huge misconception that we see is for clients who are no longer safe in their home and need to move out, sometimes they need to terminate their lease a little bit earlier. And sometimes when landlords hear that, they just want to evict them right away and charge them a lot of fees. But under the state law, landlords can't do that. If a tenant needs to leave due to safety reasons related to domestic violence, and they have either a protective order or a police report that shows they are the victim, they do have the right to break their lease without being labeled that eviction. And the maximum that they would pay for that lease break fee would just be 45 days worth of rent as soon as they given that notice. So I think that's something that we really educate our clients on, that they don't have to be stuck in a lease, especially if their safety is at high risk. Another common thing we see is that a landlord sometimes threatens clients to evict them if they keep calling the police. That's also a law violation in the state of Utah, that landlords can't make that threat to clients, and that clients can call public safety agencies as much as they want if they do feel like their life is threatened in that moment. So that's another penalty that we're constantly educating landlords and clients on, that if they do feel that their life is in danger and they need to call the police, that they can do so and they won't be threatened with an eviction.
So what would you say to someone who's listening to this, or maybe know of someone, what's the best advice for if they feel that they're experiencing domestic violence, what to do, but then also how to get in touch with South Valley Services?
Definitely. So I would say if you are experiencing any of these issues, or if you know of someone who is, definitely reach out for help. South Valley Services has a 24/7 hotline that you can call, and you can make an appointment with one of our case managers. We can really educate you about the protections you have in the state of Utah, and also advocate for you and help you talk to landlords to get the message across about the protections you have, and then help you through the process to get to safe housing if you do need to relocate. And then we can also assist in helping you make police reports or file for protection orders if you don't already have that in place. I know it can definitely be a complicated and intimidating process, but we're here to help you along the way so you can get those protections and be able to have safe housing.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Monique. I'd like to move over to Liz Watson with the YWCA. Liz, do you want to take a moment and just introduce yourself and talk just briefly about the services there at the YWCA?
Yes, thank you, Tony. My name is Liz Watson. I'm the Vice President of Domestic Violence and Residential Services here at YWCA, which is based in the heart of Salt Lake City. We are also a private 501c3, a nonprofit, and we've been around since 1906. We have a very broad mission to eliminate racism, empower women, and promote peace, justice, dignity, and freedom for all. And one of the main ways that we have been doing this for a number of years was building up comprehensive domestic violence and sexual assault services for victims. And right now we offer a 24/7 crisis line. We offer walk-in services. We offer emergency shelter, transitional housing, a lot of children's services here at the YWCA, and also a vast array of other supportive services similar to the ones Monique has flagged. And they're through our walk-in center, the Family Justice Center.
Good. So same question that I've talked to Monique and Nick about. So what are the frequently asked questions that the public calls up reaching out to the Y for?
So I think one of the most common questions that we get is, do I need to come into shelter in order to receive help? If you're in a domestic violence or sexual assault relationship. That is a misconception. You do not have to come into shelter. That said, we've been providing that critical service that Monique spoke about. Emergency shelter is unfortunately often needed by many individuals and families for their safety. And here at the YWCA, we're often housing over 180 adults and children any given night. Because they need that safe space away from abuse. And if anyone does need that, I want to encourage them to reach out to our crisis line and talk to one of our advocates so that they can plan safely for an exit and a plan to come into shelter. And I want people to know that that service is free and it's confidential and it's completely without judgment. That often worries people a lot about what their reception is going to be when they say, this is what I've experienced. Having said all that again about those essential emergency shelter services, I do want to underline that there are many other supports available for survivors of domestic and sexual violence that enable them to stay in their current home or to secure new accommodation that is away from and unknown by an abuser, and that can be essential. As I said, we're home to a very special program here called the Salt Lake Area Family Justice Center. That is that walk-in center. It's open Monday through Friday from 9 to 4. And it's this unique collaborative model that brings together nonprofit and governmental services into one partnership so that we can provide the wraparound services that we know often that individuals and families need to attain safety and ongoing stability. And that could be anything from legal assistance to economic and employment supports, or from financial aid to medical interventions. And that's all under one roof here at the Family Justice Center. The last thing I want to flag, again, it's a different form of housing assistance that we have here, is we offer our own affordable housing apartments right here in the city centre. And again, it's a very specific form of housing assistance that's been proven to benefit survivors of domestic and sexual violence who need secure accommodation, but maybe some ongoing case management services for a transitional period to recover from the trauma that they and their children have experienced. And right now we've got 36 2- and 3-bedroom apartments that are available on an affordable basis to single parent families who might be looking for that low income housing with those wraparound supports.
Excellent, excellent. I want you to expand a little bit more, say a little bit more about the services that the Y is offering to survivors who are experiencing trauma in regards to therapy, and then also into housing. So a little bit more about kind of what you were saying.
Absolutely. So the trauma is very real for survivors. Nick mentioned post-traumatic stress disorder, which may well be experienced by survivors, along with a whole other range of behavioral health issues after being subjected to physical, emotional, psychological, financial abuse. Often, and that abuse may often have been going on for years. And so we are a trauma-informed agency. All our staff are trained in understanding what trauma is, how it can be caused, and what the impact can be on survivors, and so how we can best support them. And so we have 24/7 staff available here on site to provide a listening ear and interventions as needed. But some more specific supports that we have, if anyone comes to reside here at the YWCA Utah or is accessing that walk-in center, they will have a dedicated case manager who's there to identify what it is that a survivor needs and connect them with those resources. And we've been very lucky recently to have the services of a mental health and behavioral health case manager who has worked really hard to connect all of our clients to some of our partners in the community so that they can receive, say, therapy supports both while they're here at the YWCA and when hopefully they move on into kind of their longer term stable housing, that they can have that connection. So we benefit from a lot of partnerships throughout Salt Lake City and are always looking with those partners to see what services they can bring on site, but also continue later on in the community setting. Separately from all of those wraparound trauma services, housing is obviously key to folks feeling secure and stable. We have a really passionate housing team here, just like they do at South Valley, and we collaborate very often with supports. But we have a really passionate housing team here, and I encourage anyone, if they are feeling that they've been impacted by domestic or sexual violence or been impacted by some of the discriminations that Nick talked about, to get in touch with our housing team as soon as possible, because we can help with everything from removing barriers or making additional resources available. So if you're in rent arrears as a result of the domestic or sexual violence, we might be able to support you before we're getting to the stage of an eviction, or we might be able to negotiate with your landlord around that eviction and keep you in the housing. Or as Monique said, if your safety is not secure in your current housing, then please let us help you to navigate this. It is complex. There are lots and lots of supports and protections out there, but it is complex. So let us help you navigate breaking a lease early without those penalties, and knowing what your rights are. But that housing team is available here throughout the week at the Family Justice Center.
Good, excellent. Thank you so much, Liz. I have some policy questions for everyone, kind of more of like, policy, what's working here locally, or what would be your dream kind of like, policy or initiatives that would help some of the issues that we've talked about. But first, I want to start bringing in some of the questions that we've been receiving during the AMA. The first one is from Madison on Instagram. Her question is, can you speak to the community about a concrete plan to create a lot more realistic, affordable housing as soon as possible? So this is something that I can kind of speak to on behalf of the Housing and Neighborhood Development Division. Salt Lake City currently is operating under the Growing SLC, a 5-year housing plan. This is something that was it's put in place in 2018 and it goes until 2022. This plan was helped and developed with a lot of amazing stakeholders, everyone from those who need affordable housing, those who offer temporary affordable housing resources, as well as permanent supportive housing or restricted housing. It's a very diverse plan in the Growing SLC plan that kind of goes through and gives a really long and broad list of these are the different things that the city should be working on towards increasing overall housing affordability for everyone, but then also dedicated units that are considered affordable. So I definitely recommend, and we'll try to drop it into the chat, a link to the city's Growing SLC housing plan. And again, that's a plan that the council approved, that the RDA uses, our team at the Housing and Neighborhood Development Office uses it, as well as planning. So I definitely would like to refer Madison to that document. And then if there's any other follow-up that Madison might have, we would definitely like to make sure that we're answering any specific questions that you have. Our information with Housing and Neighborhood Development is listed there along next to the plan. Okay, second question. So a question from Michael on Facebook. Do landlords need to pay extra fees if they rent to somebody with a felony conviction? I'm going to maybe point this towards Nick. Nick, would you like to jump in with this? And I can reread the question if needed.
No, I can see it in the chat here. Thanks for your question, Michael. The short answer is that under the Fair Housing Act, landlords are not really able to discriminate against people based on simply having a felony conviction of any kind that happened at any time. And so landlords should not need to pay extra fees if they rent to somebody with a felony conviction. And that could actually be if the city that you live in, like perhaps Ogden, I believe requires such fees, that could actually be a fair housing violation on the part of the city. Fair Housing Act is meant to be fair. There are a lot of details which I won't get into, but ultimately, if you've committed a crime at some point in your past life, and you've made up for that, quote unquote, served your time, you've you're no longer doing the thing that landed you with those charges in the first place, then it's not really fair to keep you out of housing for the rest of your life on that basis. So no, landlords don't need to pay extra fees. And if that's happening, that could be something that you could potentially get out of having to do or potentially challenge. And you could contact us if you wanted to talk about more details. I'm sorry, that's kind of a vague answer.
Well, our third question, actually, it's kind of a little bit of a follow-up to what you were just talking to. And I think, Nick, you might be the best one to speak to it. So the third question is from Michael on Facebook. He's asking, so what are the risks or negative repercussions of renting to a felon? And is it legal to discriminate against them?
Yeah, so it's another complicated question, and I'll give the lawyerly answer that all lawyers love. It depends. Really, it comes down to what the reason is for discriminating against somebody with a felony conviction. Is it really a good faith attempt to protect, the safety of your other tenants, or the security of your building? Or is it based on stereotype, maybe about criminals or about about people of different races or something like that. So, you know, if somebody was convicted of arson 2 years ago, that's maybe something that a landlord would be able to legitimately say, well, maybe I don't want to risk renting to this person, and that would be a disqualification. But if they have a misdemeanor shoplifting charge from 11 years ago, you know, and they have a good, you know, they qualify for the unit, and then it doesn't really make sense to keep them out. So it's a big sliding scale with with not a ton of clear answers, which I'm sorry for.
Since you had two questions kind of related to, you know, both on this perspective of, you know, if someone does have a criminal history, if landlords are a little bit leery, what's the best kind of advice, or where's a good place to kind of direct, you know, either one towards, you know, information about becoming a renter or renting to? Where would it be in your advice to kind of send them for more additional information so they can read up on that?
The best place would probably be the Department of Justice put out a fact sheet about this issue, and it's written in an FAQ sort of way. And I think we could, you know, get that onto the chat or something by the end of the session today.
Excellent. Excellent. Thanks, Nick. One more question. Sorry, Nick, I got one more question for you. So our fourth question is from Vard on Facebook. Earlier you mentioned the Disability Law Center does a testing program. How does someone become a fair housing tester?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Great question. So anybody can be, well, any adult can be a fair housing tester. We need people, you know, of all races, genders, ages, religions. You know, the whole point is to have a diverse group of people so that we can, you know, reflect the city that we live in with the tests that we conduct. And the way to do that is basically submit an application to us. You can find the application at www.disabilitylawcenter.org. And we're kind of always hiring, always looking for testers. So thanks.
Good. Another question, and it's Nick, but then it's also kind of Ethan, because Ethan, you mentioned it earlier, and I believe you said an average about 300 calls to the Disability Law Center for folks reaching out saying that I feel that my fair housing protections have been violated. Going through that was about 300. Do we know, can we break that down a little bit more, even just for Salt Lake City, how many of those are, you know, just calls versus confirmed cases that then get advanced on to possible litigation? Any more information that Ethan or Nick that you might have?
Yeah, in terms of the confirmed cases, that's a little bit hard. So to really get a confirmation that a violation of the law has occurred, you have to get to the end of a complaint process and have either the state of Utah, the federal government, or a judge say, you know, after a trial or similar, this was discrimination that violated the law. So fully confirmed is a little bit harder to say, but basically all of the cases that we take seems like discriminatory conduct has occurred. You know, and so any of the cases that we would have reported to the city would have been cases that we found, you know, that the call was credible and presented something that was probably against the law.
Excellent. Good. Switching over to kind of some of the policy stuff that we were kind of talking about, and maybe this is for Liz or Monique, you can raise your hand to see which one you would like to kind of cover this. So we talked about the Violence Against Women's Act. It lapsed in 2019. The current administration has shown support for it. In fact, Congress even reauthorized the Violence Against Women's Act. Now, if the Senate confirms it as well, then we'll see how far it gets or any changes to it. Can you just kind of talk about just kind of the basic protections that that act held for victims of domestic violence in housing, and why it was so important, and why it was sad to see it go away, and why it's encouraging that it's coming back. Liz or Monique, would you like to dive into that? How about Monique?
Yeah, so definitely. So for those who don't know too much about it, the Violence Against Women Act was really created to support comprehensive, cost-effective responses to domestic violence, sexual assault, dating, and stalking victims when it comes to housing. One of the biggest protections for this federal law is that clients are protected when it comes to receiving federal housing subsidies. So for example, maybe we have a client who is living in a project-based Section 8 unit, or maybe they have a Section 8 or housing choice voucher and they need to relocate. Under VAWA, they're able to do that without having their voucher at risk. I think this is a big misconception. For those who have those type of housing vouchers, if you end your lease early or if you need to move, a lot of times that means you're giving up your voucher. But with this protection, especially since we're knowing that some of these clients have to move for safety reasons, just letting them know that they can move and that that voucher can be transferred with them. And another great protection for it as well is, say if you have a long-term housing voucher, Section 8 voucher that was mainly it qualified through the perpetrator or the abuser, and it really isn't in the victim's name. Another protection of VAWA is that the victim can see if they qualify for a voucher of their own. That way they don't have to stay with their perpetrator in order to access those that housing service, and they can maintain their housing without being tied to the perpetrator. So that's really a big protection that we educate a lot of our clients on. And then one last thing is just that clients can't be discriminated for disclosing that they're a victim of domestic violence. So if they're applying for these federal housing funds and say, you know, they're afraid that their landlord is going to say that they have domestic violence issues in the past, or that if they disclose they're a victim of domestic violence, that they won't get that voucher, just letting them know that that's a federal protection. And being a victim does not disqualify you from getting those housing vouchers or going into those subsidized units.
Excellent, excellent.
And
Can
can I add something onto that?
Please.
And that's something that Salt Lake City, as we receive our federal dollars, we ensure that any partner that we fund is following through that with that reasonable transfer for a survivor of domestic violence, assault, sexual assault, or stalking. And so we also can get reports on that, and then we'll work with our partners to ensure that there is follow through on that.
Excellent. And then Ethan, I was going to ask you this next question. So this next question comes from Ryan on Facebook. He's asking, are these services built into 211 already, and the app specifically? So I'm not sure what he means by the app specifically. Maybe the different apps in 211 or the agencies. But Ethan, can you talk about if these some of these, definitely the folks here and some of the other resources that we've been talking about are listed on 211?
Yeah, definitely all of our community partners should be listed on 211. I'm not super familiar with the app off the top of my head, so I can't answer that question for sure. But I would assume yes, that all the partners on this call and then would be on 211. As far as the housing services, most of those are through private landlords, so those wouldn't necessarily be on there though.
Yeah, I was on mute. Just quickly say, Liz, anything else you wanted to maybe add about the Violence Against Women's Act? When it was in place, was it working great? Was there any confusion? The confusion that then it lapsed and that it might be coming back, and just kind of, you know, your position on that act and those protections.
Thank you, Tony. Yeah, the Violence Against Women Act, I've been having an internal dialogue all day as to whether the national parks in America are my favorite thing about this country, or whether or not it's the Violence Against Women Act. And it's a close run thing. Like this, I cannot tell you what a difference this act has made to the lives of survivors since it first came in 1994. And so it's always nail-biting and also exciting when it comes up for reauthorization, because it gets stronger and stronger. And it just all the time we're learning about the impact of violence and what are those core elements that promote ongoing stability and let folks kind of heal and recover and then be self-sufficient. And so that's where a lot of the changes keep coming in, is how do we make it better and stronger? And one of the main things I was thinking that I did just want to flag is that of course, the title's a little outdated. It says Violence Against Women Act. The vast majority of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, sexual assault is unfortunately perpetrated against women. But this act, just like some of our state and certainly city policies, will cover anyone of any gender identity or sexual orientation. And of course, that applies with our fair housing as well, and also applies to the services that I know that Monique offers at South Valley and that we offer at the YWCA. But really, a couple of things that are super important because it hasn't crossed the finish line yet. We really don't want to see any rollback of current protections. These have been hard fought for all victims. We want everyone to be safe, first and foremost, and then to be stable and have access to justice as needed. And definitely, I think there's many stories, unfortunately, that Monique and I and Nick will be able to kind of recount of folks being discriminated against because they were unfortunately a victim of crime. And I'm really excited because, again, this new authorization of VAWA looks to strengthen the ability for folks to reach out to emergency services without risk of being penalized by a landlord or without risk of losing their housing. And it also looks to speed up the ability to terminate a lease, which is vital when your safety is at risk. And domestic violence, we do refer to this, but I still think it's not always fully understood. Domestic violence can often be lethal. And so it's vital that we connect people with emergency supports like emergency shelter, but also so that we can enable people to be safe in the ongoing long-term housing, because shelter is meant to be transitional. And so the ability to kind of terminate leases early, the ability to port any vouchers easily and with protections is vital. And I'm excited that this act is proposing to expand the vouchers available for victims and also crucially educate. I think Monique's talked about this, educate a lot of our housing providers. It's mandated in there that everyone will have this education on what it means to be a victim of domestic or sexual violence or stalking, as we've talked about, or even dating violence, and how that links to someone's housing. We don't want someone to have to choose between their safety and whether or not they're housed tonight. And that is the reality for many victims. They are having to say, what's going to happen if I leave this relationship, if I leave this house I'm in now, if I leave, what are my options? And oftentimes still, victims are having to return to their abuser to have somewhere to live, or they're out on the streets, and even with their children. And so that is a hard decision to make. So again, I'm so excited about this reauthorization of VAWA and encourage anyone to reach out to South Valley or the YWCA or our State Domestic Violence Coalition, UDVC, or directly to your members of Congress to encourage them and our senators to encourage them to pass this reauthorization bill.
Well said. In fact, I was just going to say something similar. The overarching overall this conversation too, talking about fair housing initiatives and protections are covered and funded through the Housing and Urban Development through HUD. So it's always one of those things too, to increase the capacity to do monitoring, do enforcement, more initiatives nationwide. We highly recommend everyone to reach out to the representatives to advocate for strengthening and enhancing the Fair Housing Act and those protections that are built in into that act. This has been a great conversation. We are almost done. There was a couple of questions that came in through Facebook, kind of related from Kimberly and from Jake. kind of relating to affordable housing. I would like to recommend that you refer to the Growing SLC 5-year housing plan that was dropped into the chat earlier. And again, if you have any other questions, Ethan and I are city staff employees. Our information is on our website. And for the city, you can definitely reach out and we can be happy to follow up to answer those questions specifically.
I'll throw in my email and feel free to reach out to me, Kimberly and Jake.
Good. Another thing too, just we are basically out of time right now. Any just last, maybe just take another minute. Any last thing that any of the panelists would like to get out there that we didn't already cover? Okay.
I would just say I gave some it depends answers. Anybody that was unsatisfied and wants something a little more particular is welcome to give us a call or go to our website.
Excellent. Good, good.
And I would always like to remind everyone of their opportunity and their availability, like we've been talking about this entire conversation, to report incidents of fair housing and seek out safe services for domestic violence. Those are rights affordable to everyone in the United States and Utah.
Well said. Okay, with that, we will conclude this AMA. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us. We greatly appreciate it. Huge, huge appreciation to our amazing panelists for joining us today and all of the amazing information and experience that you were able to share with us today. Please know how much we greatly appreciate this information as we celebrate April as Fair Housing Month. And with that, we'll conclude. Thank you, everyone. Take care.